Welcome back to NewsX World. I'm Joshua Barnes and you're watching The World Report. Let's first take a look at our top stories. Russian President Vladimir Putin has suggested that a deal with the US on nuclear arms control could be made at the summit with Trump in Alaska tomorrow. It comes as Russia's defense ministry says that further territory has been captured in Ukraine's Donetsk region. It comes as the EU has welcomed Donald Trump's comments relating to security guarantees for Ukraine and hopes of putting an end to more than 3 years of war. It comes as Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky meets with UK Prime Minister Keir Starmer at Downing Street. Meanwhile, Zelensky says that 84 Ukrainian prisoners of war have been exchanged with Russia, some of whom have been held for more than a decade. Meanwhile, strikes have been reported from both Kyiv and Moscow, with injuries reported after Ukrainian strikes in the Belgorod and Volgograd regions. The EU says it is committed to getting the trade deal with the US finalised as soon as possible. The EU Commission spokesperson says that communication has been received from the US, giving suggestions relating to finishing the deal document. Israel's far-right minister Bezalel Smotrich has approved plans for a settlement that will split East Jerusalem from the occupied West Bank. His office says the move would bury the idea of a Palestinian state. The UN Commission has found that violence against Syrian Alawites likely included war crimes in a report released today. Sectarian violence in the Alawite heartland saw murder, torture and inhumane acts with dead bodies, according to the report. This comes as 4 people were killed and 5 others injured in an explosion on the outskirts of Idlib in Syria, that according to Syrian state news. Syria's official news reports authorities are still working to verify the nature of the blast. And wildfires in several European nations are continuing to rage on, with 3 lives claimed so far in the blazes. Mass evacuations have been ordered, with 440,000 hectares scorched so far this year, double what is expected at this time. But we again this hour lead with the Russia-Ukraine conflict and start with Russian President Vladimir Putin, who has said the US administration is making energetic and sincere efforts to resolve the conflict in Ukraine, and suggested that Moscow and Washington could reach a deal on nuclear arms control. Speaking at a Kremlin meeting with senior military and civilian officials, Putin said discussions with the United States are aimed at creating long-term conditions for peace between our countries in Europe and in the world as a whole, if agreements on strategic offensive weapons are reached in later stages. Putin is due to meet US President Donald Trump in Alaska on Friday. The New START treaty, the last remaining pillar of US-Russia nuclear arms control, limits deployed strategic nuclear weapons and is set to expire in February next year.
Уважаемые коллеги, добрый день. Попросил вас сегодня собраться для того, чтобы проинформировать о том, как идет переговорный процесс по украинскому кризису, как идут переговоры в двухстороннем формате с украинской делегацией. Так или иначе, многие из присутствующих знают, разумеется, в общих чертах, но я расскажу поподробнее. Это первое. И второе, рассказать о том, на каком этапе мы находимся с американской администрацией сегодняшней, которая, как всем хорошо известно, предпринимает, на мой взгляд, достаточно энергичные и искренние усилия для того, чтобы прекратить боевые действия, прекратить кризис и выйти на договоренности, представляющие интерес для всех вовлеченных в этот конфликт сторон, для того, чтобы создать долгосрочные условия мира и между нашими странами, и в Европе, да и в мире в целом, если мы к следующим этапам выйдем на договоренности в области контроля над стратегическими наступательными вооружениями. Это то, что я хотел сказать.
Well, these comments, of course, come just ahead of an extremely pivotal meeting in a war that has raged for over 3 years. President Trump and President Putin sitting down one-on-one to discuss how to get closer to peace in the Russia-Ukraine conflict. Of course, a lot of developments today we've been following throughout the day and bringing those to you. Volodymyr Zelensky meeting with UK Prime Minister Keir Starmer, this coming a day after a meeting with European leaders and President Donald Trump, in which they're looking at safety guarantees for Ukraine. Of course, Donald Trump's rhetoric on this conflict has flipped and changed throughout the last few months. So that meeting with Volodymyr Zelensky in the White House, of course, an extreme blow-up of relations between the US and Ukraine, which saw a brief pause on military aid, with Donald Trump asking Volodymyr Zelensky to pay back all of the US aid that had been sent. That has since changed. Of course, Donald Trump putting a deadline on Russia to try and get this war ended. It was initially 50 days, brought down to 10 to 12, and then a deadline did pass, but this meeting, of course, announced. It is hugely pivotal in this conflict. There are so many nations that have been involved, allies of Ukraine, allies of Russia, also contributing to the war effort, but also aid and defensive weapons as well. We are now joined by Helena Yanchenko, who is a member of Parliament, joining us live from Ukraine. Helena, thank you ever so much for taking the time to speak with us. Some clear points from Vladimir Putin's comments which I want to raise. He says that the US administration is making energetic and sincere efforts to end this conflict. In your eyes, is Putin trying to butter up Donald Trump before this meeting?
I am quite convinced that an only interest of Putin is to continue the war. And by all these statements, saying and tricks, he's just trying to buy more time. This is basically the first time when Putin agreed to actually have some kind of talks and negotiations. He used to ignore the previous attempts to have any negotiations moderated by someone like US or, let's say, our friends from Saudi Arabia, or etc., etc. But when President Trump has started to talk about real consequences, about secondary sanctions, Russia realized that they will be cut out of financial resources. And currently we see that Russia has enough of human resources to continue aggressive war of aggression in Ukraine. They have enough of defense or military resources, but what they are really dependent on is financial resources. Last year, they spent $150 billion on this bloody war in Ukraine. And they basically have sponsors of this war. This war is sponsored by international trade. Once again, last year, only India and China, only these two countries, bought oil from Russia worth of $115 billion. So it's almost the same amount of money which Russia has spent on the bloody war in Ukraine. By that, we can actually say that it's trade with India and China which sponsors this war. And that's why secondary sanctions, so basically the idea to give all other countries in the world a choice, you either cooperate with Russia, you trade with Russia, you help Russia sponsor the war, or you trade with the rest of the world. So these secondary sanctions, in my opinion, is an only real tool to force Russia to stop the war. And when President Trump raised this issue, Putin has changed his rhetoric right away, and he started to talk about conditions to end the war. He agreed to travel around and meet Trump to discuss the end of the war, etc., etc.
Yes, and of course that question over secondary sanctions continues to be raised, with only India so far hit with higher tariffs. So the effectiveness of that ploy still being brought into question. Let's look broader now at this meeting between Trump and Putin. From a Ukrainian perspective, is this seen as a turning point or further rhetoric?
Of course it is seen. And we Ukrainians, we are sick and tired of this war. You should understand that Ukrainians suffer. Mothers like me, I have children, like small children, they are 8 and 13. They became refugees because of the war. Millions of families are separated. Thousands of families, civilians, are killed during the night because of Russian attacks that are taking place over the past 3.5 years. Thousands of people are being kidnapped on the occupied territories and tortured later on. Thousands of children are being kidnapped from their families on the occupied territories. So this is not a joke. This is the bloodiest war since the World War II in the world. And we are the victims, and we have to fight back for 3.5 years. So we are sick and tired. We want this war to be over. We were ready to do anything, everything to end this war. But Russia goes on. And Russia has enough of funds because of the trade, because they trade their oil and gas, including trading with India and China. And it helps to sponsor this ongoing war. And it helps to sponsor this terrorism that they commit in Ukraine against poor civilian Ukrainians, against children, against women, against people who did nothing, innocent civilians.
Helena, if you do stay with us, thank you for that insight and those comments. If you stay with us as we bring another developments from the diplomacy around these talks, and the European leaders have welcomed US support for Ukraine security guarantees. The European Commission said President Trump's commitment to participate in defending Ukrainian territorial integrity is a positive step. The announcement follows a virtual meeting with European leaders, the US and Ukrainian officials, aimed at strengthening support for Kyiv amid the ongoing war with Russia. The EU also stressed that any territorial changes must be agreed politically. In light of recent Israeli settlement projects in the West Bank, the Commission urged an end to illegal transfers and evictions, reaffirming commitment to international law and the protection of civilian rights. Let's now listen to what the EU spokesperson said on this matter.
Also, a clear outcome of the meeting is that it is for Ukraine to decide on the matter of territorial integrity. Furthermore, on security guarantees, Ukraine forces must be able to defend their country. And of course, we welcome that the US President has said that the US would participate to such security guarantees. Last but not least, another point of general consensus was pressure on Russia. From our side, we know very well that sanctions work. They're putting high pressure on Russia. We have already 18 sanction packages implemented. As we have been saying already in the previous days, we are currently working on a 19th package.
Well, we welcome back Helena Yanchenko, a Member of Parliament in Ukraine, to discuss these developments as well. Helena, of course, the EU welcoming comments by Donald Trump. Can they be trusted, what Donald Trump has said?
Of course, we don't know yet. We can only pray for Trump and, keep our fingers crossed. But I believe and I hope that we are as close to the end of the war as we only can. And I really hope that Donald Trump is smart enough, he's brave enough, and for sure he is powerful enough to end this war by implying secondary sanctions on Russia, cutting them off the financial resources to continue this war, and basically cutting them off the international or global economics. So that will have consequences for Russia, not only in terms of their capacity to continue the war, but like generally it will cause consequences. To end my comment, I should tell you and I should remind you that unfortunately Ukraine is not the first victim of Russian aggression and Russian occupation. This is Russian ongoing systematic and sustainable state politics. They've been invading their neighbors for the past 30 years. They started to mess with Moldova in 1991. They later on killed a lot of people in Chechnya. In 2008, they invaded in Georgia. In 2014, they invaded in Ukraine for the first time. And in 2022, they started a full-scale invasion. And even now, while they continue this war of aggression in Ukraine, they already threat European countries that they will invade. Poland, Baltic countries, etc., etc. So if they are not punished, if they don't bear some consequences, they will simply continue messing with the global security architecture.
Yes.
And we need to do something with that. It's not a problem of Ukraine solely. Now it's a problem of each and every country in this world and each and every citizen, because tomorrow they can invade any other country.
Yes, absolutely. And Helena, that of course is a concern of Western allies of Ukraine, something that has been raised about the security of Europe moving forward relating to this conflict. But Helena, if you can stay with us once again, we have another fresh development, whereas Russia and Ukraine have exchanged 84 prisoners of war each, the latest in a series of swaps that have freed hundreds of prisoners of war this year. That according to both governments. The Russian Defense Ministry said the exchange was mediated by the UAE and that returned Russian personnel are receiving psychological and medical care. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky said the group included both military personnel and civilians, some detained since 2014, 2016 and 2017, as well as defenders of Mariupol, the strategic port city captured by Russia in 2022 after a lengthy siege. Zelensky shared images of smiling returned troops wrapped in Ukrainian flags and vowed there would be more exchanges. Large-scale prisoner of war swaps have been the main outcome of peace talks held in Istanbul earlier this year. Well, Helena, thank you once again for staying with us. How significant are these prisoner of war swaps, not just for the progress towards peace, but also for morale, not just for the soldiers' families, but also for civilians in Ukraine? Hello, Helena. Just checking you can hear me. Well, yes, you can. Fantastic. Hello, Helena. I just wanted to ask about the significance of these prisoner of war swaps for morale in Ukraine. Of course, not just for those families, but given that it's another signal of potential peace.
It is a kind of a signal, but when we were discussing possible negotiation track and generally the track of the end of the war, with the participation of some mediators, so the third countries which can serve as mediators, we warned them that Russia cannot be trusted. Putin is a pathological liar. We had 200 rounds of negotiation with Russia, direct negotiations with Russia, starting with 2014 and ending with a full-scale invasion. We've been trying to negotiate various kind of things. Russia would always come to negotiations, decide or agree on something, but then they would break each and every agreement. So we warn our partners and those who want to serve as mediators that you cannot trust Russia. So what we also suggested is to have a very specific, I would say smart, this specific, measurable, achievable, etc., criterias to measure whether Ukraine or Russia really do something to come closer to the end of the war. So we suggested to stop the missiles attack in air, in sea, and the third thing that we suggested is to exchange all prisoners of war. All prisoners of war. Currently in Russia, there are thousands of Ukrainians, not only military, but also civilians who are kept in prisons, who are being tortured, who are being cut, etc., etc. And When we are talking about thousands of people who are captured and kept in the conditions that don't match any Geneva convents or any other convents or any any even logic, and then they agree to trade just a couple dozen people, that's far from what really matters. This is
Yes.
far from a real criteria that we put on the table.
Helena Yanchenko, we are unfortunately out of time, but thank you ever so much for such a unique insight. Of course, all eyes will now be on that summit between President Donald Trump and President Vladimir Putin to be held in Alaska tomorrow. We will, of course, bring you all of the updates leading up to that and then live as that meeting takes place. Let's now shift to trade, though. And the European Commission has confirmed receiving a document from the United States containing proposed language for finalising their joint statement on trade and tariffs. Commission spokesperson Olaf Gill said the US suggestions aim to bring the political agreement closer to completion. Olaf Gill, European Commission spokesperson for economic security, trade and financial services, said both sides will continue to ping-pong the texts back and forth at technical and political levels until a final version is agreed, but gave no timeline for that completion. The EU and US reached a framework trade deal in late July after President Donald Trump and Commission President Ursula von der Leyen shook hands on the accord at Trump's Scottish Golf Club. So far, only the baseline tariff of 15% has been enacted. Key elements, including a promised cut in US car tariffs from 27.5% to 15%, have yet to take effect. Tariffs on 50% on steel and aluminium also remain in place. The joint statement, expected to run only a few pages, will serve as a political roadmap for further trade negotiations and not a legally binding agreement. Tariffs on pharmaceuticals and semiconductors remain at zero, although Washington is probing whether new duties capped at 15% should be applied. Well, joining us to discuss all of these updates is John Rosamondo, the president of Viking Research Associates, who joins us live from Washington, D.C. John, as always, it is a pleasure to have you on the programme. I want to briefly just look more broadly here. Of course, so many of these trade deals being reached between the US and other nations, the signalling the significance of that moment where two leaders, in this case Ursula von der Leyen and Donald Trump, come to an agreement. But this is more of an insight into the reality and the workings of the deal. Is there still a lot of work to be done from the US on deals that are in effect done, but in reality potentially still with several bits to detail and outline?
President Trump has made tariffs the hallmark of his presidency, trying to get other countries to reduce their tariffs, in this case, the European Union. I'm hopeful that some of the remaining elements can be worked out to allow the sale of more American goods in the European market, which has been closed off to U.S. manufacturers.
Yes, and John, let's now look at this deal between the US and the EU. Of course, key trading areas that are still hit with higher than 15% tariffs, steel and aluminium, one of them, and also cars. We know a lot of European cars are exported. How significant are these deals on items that have already received higher rates of tariff for the US consumer?
Well, in terms of U.S. consumers, I think President Trump's effort is to get Americans to buy more American-made products. I think a lot of manufacturers from Europe and elsewhere have onshored here in the U.S. to get around these tariffs. So I think that the impacts will be marginal. But I also think that it's a good thing to see the Europeans agreeing to reduce their tariffs.
Yes, and John, to end this discussion, of course, no timeline given, but a consensus that this is moving forward. Do you think this is a win for Donald Trump, that a deal of 15% has been struck with the EU?
Well, absolutely. It just shows that President Trump is a master negotiator. he always raises the bar to something that the other side would consider absurd, and then
Yes, absolutely. John, you will be staying with us as we move away from trade now. When we look towards the Middle East, as Israel's far-right finance minister Bezalel Smotrich says his government will push ahead with a long-frozen settlement plan in the occupied West Bank, a move he claims will bury the idea of a Palestinian state. Speaking in Mal Adamum, Smotrich announced construction of more than 3,400 housing units in the so-called E1 area, connecting the settlements to Jerusalem. This is what the far-right leader Smotrich has said.
מי שמנסה היום בעולם להכיר במדינה פלסטינית יקבל מאיתנו תשובה בשטח. לא במסמכים, לא בהחלטות או הצהרות, אלא בעובדות. בעובדות של בתים, בעובדות של שכונות, כבישים ועוד ועוד משפחות יהודיות שבונות חיים. הם ידברו על החלום השקרי הפלסטיני. אנחנו נמשיך לבנות מציאות יהודית מגשימה. המציאות הזו קוברת סופית את רעיון המדינה הפלסטינית. פשוט כי אין במה להכיר ואין למי להכיר.
Well, many consider settlements illegal under international law, a position that Israel disputes. Let's now listen to how Palestinians are reacting.
تصريحات سموتريش اليوم هي امتداد لسلوك يومي ميداني للمستوطنين في الضفة الغربية، ولكن الخطورة هنا اليوم بهذا الإعلان هو إعلان صريح بإنهاء أي وهم لحل الدولتين.
We condemn completely what the Israelis are planning for new settlements in the West Bank. All settlements are against the law, against the agreements since Oslo, and we agree that there should not be any unilateral action in the Palestinian land.
Well, John Rosamondo, thank you ever so much for staying with us. Of course, a significant announcement here, and this comes in the wake of several world leaders from across the globe, not just Europe, but also we've seen in Australia and New Zealand as well, Western leaders calling for potentially recognising a Palestinian state and a two-state solution. Do you think these comments from Smotrich are a direct response to that and a direct rejection of that international commitment to a potential two-state solution?
Well, absolutely. I mean, Smotrich is a radical nationalist who believes that Israel has full rights over what they call Judea and Samaria, and the rest of the world refers to as the West Bank. The only thing it will do is justify the Palestinian extremists who similarly don't believe in Israel's right to exist. I think that what we've seen is basically the evaporation of the center on the Palestinian side and on the Israeli side. So, we've seen the rise in terrorism, galvanize the Israeli public to vote for these far-right parties that offer security, but at the same time, they embolden terrorist organizations like Fatah's Al-Aqsa Martyrs, Hamas, etc.
Yes, John, do you think Donald Trump will back this? We know he's staunch in backing Israel with their policies in Gaza, also supporting them in conflict with Iran. But this could be polarising and, as you've mentioned, could cause further divides on both sides.
Well, I'm hopeful that President Trump will try to push Netanyahu toward the middle to cancel these settlements, because the only thing that they do is inflame extremism on both sides. I mean, we need to move back to promoting the sensible center in Israel and among the Palestinians, because when you have fanatical extremists on both sides. I mean, it wasn't that long that Smotrich himself was sanctioned by the Israeli government So, I mean, Netanyahu chose to get together with Smotrich's party because he didn't have a majority in the Knesset. I would hope that the Israeli electorate would realize that the only thing they're doing is emboldening the Palestinian terrorists.
John Rosamondo, thank you ever so much for your insights on both of those topics. Of course, reaction expected from this announcement from Smotrich, and we will bring that to you. But for now, that is all we have time for. Stay tuned here on NewsX World for all of the latest from across the globe.